what he would do is have a court system in place that looks like a court system. There's a court system in Russia, there's a court system in Hungary, but those courts, if it's a dispute between me and my neighbor, they call balls and strikes the way they normally would have. It's only in situations where the interests of the state or friends of the state or other leaders with power are involved where it's just a masquerade and you realize that the fix was always in.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here to the Commonwealth Club, the Public Affairs program, and I am just honored to be here. We're going to have a wonderful discussion tonight, and in a few moments, our guest of honor will provide some introductory comments, but I am here as the City Attorney of San Francisco to introduce Jeff Fleisch as we launch into a conversation on, I think, a topic that so many of us are thinking about at this moment, which is the state of our democracy through the conversation around the Trump administration and our judiciary. So Jeff Fleisch. Jeff has an incredibly long biography, and I'm only going to read a small portion of it, but he is currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. He is chair of the Jeff Fleisch Center. No relationship, right, Jeff? The Jeff Fleisch Center on Democracy and Disruptive Technologies at Flinders University. He previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to Australia and as special counsel to President Obama in the White House. Boy, do we miss him. For his federal service, Ambassador Fleisch has received numerous awards, including the Sue Cobb Medal, which is the State Department's highest award for a non-career ambassador. I will just say on a personal note, I've worked with Jeff in many capacities. When I served both in San Francisco City Hall, but also in our state legislature. And I think, Jeff, you and I met 25 years ago when you were the chair of the board of a civil rights organization that I was a very young civil rights attorney. That was 5 law jobs for me ago. But without further ado, I'd like to invite up Ambassador Jeff Fleisch.
Thanks, David. Can you all hear me with this microphone? Good. Well, thank you, David. You've been an outstanding city attorney for San Francisco and a great advocate. I understand you just served your 7th lawsuit against the Trump administration today. Right. I also want to thank the organizers of this program tonight. My focus tonight is just going to be on rule of law, which you could go on for an hour. I'm going to try and condense it to 10 or 15 minutes of laying the groundwork, and then David and I will have a conversation about some of the issues that have been raised. My focus is going to be the following things. First, a bit about the purpose of attacking the rule of law, why it's done, some of the actions that have been taken by the current administration to accomplish that, what the administration, the president, are likely to do next, and what all of us can do about it. David was very generous about my background, but my one thing that he didn't have a chance to mention is that I have a fairly bipartisan background. I've been served both Democrats and Republicans, and I've never had a sense that either party had a monopoly on good ideas or good people. Just to give you an example, I clerked for Judge Abner Mikva, probably one of the most liberal members of the D.C. Circuit, and then I clerked for Chief Justice Rehnquist, who would not be described that way, and then went into therapy immediately afterward. But I've also, I've served under both Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Jerry Brown. So I've held lots of positions that are strictly nonpartisan, ambassador or, a federal special master. I've had a couple of appointments with the intelligence community. So I'm not partisan. But this is inevitably going to be a political topic. So for those of you who did not have a chance to go by the wine station before you came in, I apologize. You may at some point during our conversation need to get some. Let me just level set on what we mean by rule of law. Rule of law is a bedrock principle of democracy. Now, people have been trying to confuse it recently and conflate rule of law with enforcement of law. Those are two very different things. Rule of law was explained very succinctly by Thomas Paine in his, at the time of our revolution, in the book Common Sense. He said the rule of law, no person is king, the law is king. So the law applies equally to everyone, even the most powerful elected official, even to the wealthiest person in the world, even to the commander-in-chief of the U.S. forces. And that principle, that the law rules, no individual just makes up whatever they want to have happen and they rule, is under assault. This is different from the first administration. President Trump complained a lot about the law, and he complained about judges. They did many things that were damaging to the rule of law, but he didn't do a full-on assault on the rule of law. This time, it's different. He's attacking the rule of law from multiple angles. First, he's just flagrantly violating the law, taking actions that exceed his authority under settled law. One good example of this is birthright citizenship. 14th Amendment says explicitly, if you're a conservative, what you believe in is textualism and then the original meaning of the language of the Constitution. 14th Amendment says absolutely that any person born in the United States is, by virtue of that, a U.S. citizen. And if you're concerned about original intent, within, a generation of that law being passed, it was tested in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, it means what it says. This has been settled law ever since the time of the enactment of the 14th Amendment. And yet he's claiming that he can write an executive order that overturns all of that constitutional precedent. He's claiming powers to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, something which only Congress can do. And he's taking actions that are solely within the province of the courts and Congress. Second, he's attacking all the institutions responsible for calling out and preventing illegal actions and abuses of power. He's threatened members of coordinate branches into abdicating their role. Congress was sort of first and foremost, and that started with, probably the most significant thing that members of the House do is select their own leader, their Speaker of the House. And the President of the United States said, I think I'm going to pick your Speaker of the House. And he did. They let him. They submitted to his power. And he said, and if I'm going to pick all of the cabinet secretaries, and even though there is advice and consent by the Senate, if you are going to oppose me, then I'll do one of two things. Either I'll make it a recess appointment and just ignore you completely, and/or I will ensure that there is someone who runs against you, who's funded by Elon Musk, and will defeat you in your next primary, and I'll get someone in your seat who I like better. And by doing that, he took control of Congress. He has used that power since of having a humbled Congress, which is not performing its role of competing with the president and the courts to perform its constitutionally mandated duties. He's used that to dismantle the Department of Justice, to install a loyalist as the Attorney General, who is now purging all independent prosecutors. He's threatened to ruin law firms that file actions against him. He's threatened to impeach or defy judges who rule against him. And now he's threatened to arrest governors of sovereign states who have the temerity to challenge him. Third, he's empowering a rogue legal enforcement regime. He's building effectively a private militia in both the physical and virtual worlds that's loyal to him and that it's armed and that is violent. He's gutted the FBI that's responsible for enforcing federal law. And in its place, there are sort of two features. One is just a group of people who are supportive of him, who have been prepared to resort to political violence, and that includes January 6th insurrectionists who were convicted of coming armed to that event and then attacking police, convicted by juries, and he let them all out. That sends a very clear message that if you support him, even if you use political violence to advance his interests, you will be protected. In its place, he's taken the process in place of the FBI of reconstituting and repurposing the U.S. military to enforce domestic laws against not only non-citizens, but against American citizens who challenge his actions. And fourth, he's subverting the public's understanding of what is and is not lawful. Some of this is just using false definitions of legal principles. For example, he's claimed that the United States has been invaded by a foreign power, and he's using that invasion to bypass Congress and justify everything from tariffs to eliminating due process to invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, as well as I said, threatening to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Just to be clear what the Alien Enemies Act says, it relates to an invasion against the territory of the U.S. by any foreign nation or government. He's applying that language in a context in which there has been no invasion. Whether you think it's fentanyl, actually fentanyl trafficking and fentanyl deaths and use in the United States is much lower today than it was during his first term when he didn't declare it an invasion. The number of people crossing the border, either from Canada or from Mexico without documents, is much lower than it was at the time he left office the first time and then not declared it an emergency. And the trade deficits that we've had those trade deficits for over 20 years, and this is not even close to the largest trade deficit we've ever had. None of these are extraordinary events, none of them are invasions, and yet he has used that power in order to exercise emergency powers. The most important thing, let me add one more thing. Part of it is the language that his lawyers are using, but part of it is he's taking advantage of highly sophisticated technological tools which make it very difficult for people to know what is or is not the truth. They don't know what the facts are, they don't know who to trust, and so at some point they start to give up and are stunned into silence by the whole muzzle velocity of the actions that are being taken and the claims that are being made and the counterclaims. And in that case, you win, because if people don't know what the real law is, then they either believe your version of it, or they believe no version of it, or they just default to their own biases and everyone's got their own law and there is no rule of law. There is a playbook, and this is the playbook that he's been using. Now, I can talk a bit about why. I think most of us have lived through that. But let's just be very clear that it's because he lost the 2020 election that he is most focused on this. Machiavelli himself said that after a prince loses power and regains it, with little reluctance, he'll take the opportunity of rebellion to punish the delinquents, to clear out the suspects, and to strengthen himself in the weakest places. And so the reason he lost the 2020 election, in his view, is the courts. None of the courts went along with his claims that the 2020 election had been stolen. And so by virtue of those court decisions, which ultimately ended up with civil penalties and criminal claims against his supporters, and also lawsuits against him in which he had been indicted in federal cases, two different federal cases, he understood that the one thing that was keeping him from having his full agenda in 2020, that kept him from retaining office and that now stands in the way of his actions, are the courts and its enablers, the lawyers and the genuine public servants and the protesters. So his reasons are personal, they're political, and they're very practical. Shakespeare, in fact, who also read Machiavelli, said that when Henry VI, when King's rival reveals his plan to take the throne, he gets the advice, well, the first thing you do is you kill all the lawyers. And people always think, well, it's because lawyers are annoying. But that's not really the case. It's because lawyers are the bulwark against destruction of the rule of law. So his actions have been to purge independent prosecutors, to replace them with loyalists who will act without any legal authority, and to weaponize the law against all of his enemies, including judges and private lawyers who might oppose him. We'll get into how he's accomplishing that, David and I, and so I won't spoil the entire playbook. But one thing to appreciate is that everyone does it a little bit differently. Machiavelli describes dozens of people who attempted to move republics into autocracies. This style is very much a mob style. You had the Friday night massacre of inspectors general. You have a series of loyalty tests being administered at the Justice Department to see who the rats are. If you disagree about whether or not he won the 2020 election, you are suspect and you are pushed out. You prosecute the January 6th prosecutors and you release the people who attacked the police that day. You seize the territory of your enemy and you install your bosses and you buy off the resistance. For example, you tell Mayor Eric Adams, accused of serious corruption, that, look, if you go along with my policies, I'll let you violate those laws, it's okay. And then you tell Gavin Newsom, look, if you don't let me do what you think violate the laws in your city, I'll arrest you. That is the style that's being approached, or being pursued. So what's next? The great red line in our democracy for rule of law is Marbury versus Madison, which was decided in 1802. And it says that the final word on who determines what the law is the Supreme Court. It can't be that the president says, well, I'm a constitutional officer. I've got my own view of what the Constitution means. You may have your opinion, but I'm going to do what I want. For the entire government, the Supreme Court is supreme on this one issue, articulating what the law is. And so defying a court would effectively eliminate that rule of law which has applied since our founding. In fact, once a court pronounces things and nothing happens, then you have no rule of law at all because there's no way to enforce it. So if the president says, I actually want to stay for a third term, the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional. The president says, well, you've got 20 federal marshals who are under my control, and I've got multiple divisions of the military that will back me up. I wonder what's going to happen. So, and that's what's happened in multiple countries around the world. No one, for that reason, no president, as much as they've disagreed with Supreme Court decisions, as much as they've been frustrated by the Supreme Court, no one, including Andrew Jackson, has ever defied a Supreme Court decision. And so the fact that the president is threatening to do that is a major alarm. Will he actually do it? My guess is that he'd prefer not to, for the same reasons that inhibited every president before him. Every president before him looked at this and said, well, if I guess right, maybe I can pull this off, but it'll be hard. And if I guess wrong, it could be the end of our democracy or the end of my presidency. So I think what he is most likely to do is try and use that threat, that bluff, which is why we call this bluff justice, in order to get the courts to do what he wants them to do anyway, because they don't want to come to that ultimate decision. Or get Congress, in the face of the opposition that he is going to get from courts across the nation, to change the power of the courts. And that's precisely what's beginning to happen now. The best way to understand this is that the Supreme Court is the only court that was established by the U.S. Constitution. The Article 3 says there shall be a Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress creates. So all of the other courts that are issuing all of these decisions are a creation of Congress. And if you want to, you can change the capacity of the courts simply by going through Congress, by building up enough animus in the public against courts that are thwarting the interests of the president. One thing you can do is you can strip the power of the court to enforce the law and how they enforce it. So right now there's a thing called the No Rogues Rulings Act, NORA, it was authored by Darrell Issa in the House. It passed the House, it's now before the Senate, and it would eliminate the power of federal courts to issue nationwide injunctions. You could strip courts of their subject matter. You could eliminate the power of lower courts to decide any matters concerning the scope of the president's power altogether, and that one will likely be coming. You could reduce the geography of the courts, just dramatically reduce the number of courts in certain jurisdictions, like, say, the Northern District of California, or Manhattan, or Los Angeles, or various other places where the president has been unhappy with decisions of the courts. You could do what's called judge stripping instead of court stripping. You just dramatically reduce their budgets. Or you close the courts that they're in and you reassign them to another court. So Judge Breyer, who just issued the decision in the National Guard case, well, unfortunately, we've just reduced the number of judges here, but we've got a wonderful place for you in Guam, and there's a full-time maritime docket there, and you will be reassigned to Guam and only do maritime cases from now on. You can reset judicial calendars in 1802. 1801, it actually, Marbury versus Madison was a very contentious moment in American politics. Congress actually suspended the calendar for the Supreme Court for 9 months. For 9 months, the court didn't meet at all. This is a power that Congress has. So the impact of all of these changes would be to fill the bench with loyalists of the president and reduce their power to get in his way. Most Americans don't understand what that means in terms of the impact on their freedoms. Because we are so used to having independent courts, it's hard to imagine what it means when courts lose their independence. But if courts aren't independent, there is no free speech. The government critics or people with unpopular views aren't protected from prosecution or from assault. There's no freedom of religion. It just doesn't exist because unless you worship the religion that's acceptable to the leader, you're subject to persecution and prosecution. Corruption is rampant. Whatever people think they own or have is never truly theirs. The government or friends of the government can do and take whatever they want, whenever they want. Everyone outside the leader's personal protection lives in fear. This is the state in Hungary now and in Russia now, which once had independent courts and now no longer do. And there, the powerful and wealthy do as they wish, and everyone else suffers as they must. It's not rule of law, it's rule of the jungle. And then there's always a possibility that this isn't a bluff. You know, this president can be a little bit erratic and impulsive, and there could be a decision from the Supreme Court that just infuriates him, and he just defies the courts and sees what happens when he detonates this thermonuclear option. So what can we do about this? One thing that I know as a diplomat is that strong men never stop. They are stopped. The most important way to stop this from happening, from having this administration weaken or effectively invalidate and subordinate the courts, is just not to submit to it. If you don't submit, it doesn't happen. If you look at the law firms that challenge the executive orders, you had 9 law firms just capitulate to these clearly unlawful executive orders because they thought, well, maybe we can avoid having a hassle with this president. The next one wouldn't capitulate, and they fought, and they won. And then the next one fought and won. And then the third one fought and won. And the fourth one fought and won. Fifth one fought and won. And then some of the other AmLaw 200 firms are like, it's kind of hard to turn down a fight that you know you're going to win. And now they're signing the amicus briefs. And instead of subjugating all of these law firms, what they've found is that the majority of firms are actually joining in opposition. It's just a matter of don't submit in advance. It's the first rule of fighting authoritarianism. It's the first rule of protecting the rule of law. Do not submit to violation of the law in advance. So I have a list of things beginning with M as a way of helping. And unfortunately, there are too many of them. So, there won't be a quiz afterwards and we can hand out notes. But the first thing is mobilizing. Just organizing protests in which millions of people rally in the streets. That's what they did in Israel when Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to eliminate their equivalent of Marbury versus Madison. It also happened in Indonesia, where there was a there was a showdown between the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In those cases, people came out into the streets, they rallied, and nonviolent rally. And the most important things to remember are nonviolence, making sure that it's not just activists, it's like everybody, regular folks, all different walks of life, every different dimension in society, walking through the streets together in solidarity. That is probably the strongest force that you can bring. The message has to be very clear, though. You've got to focus on the threat to people's way of life. What I was describing, what it's like to live in a place that doesn't have rule of law. And, the concern that people should have about the government taking them away in the middle of the night and sending them to a prison in El Salvador because of something that they said or something that, that the president wishes to accomplish. The messengers. Messengers are, sometimes they can be more important than the message, but everyone can be a messenger. Every single person in this room has a network. You've got skills. You've got the capacity, whatever it is. If you know rich people, if you know powerful people, if you know politicians, you can reach out to them, but you can also just reach out to your friends. You can reach out to people who have influence in your own community. You can just reach out to people who you know in battleground states and ask them to vote. Next is monitoring. We're still sticking with M's. Monitor what this administration is doing on voter suppression. There are a whole bunch of laws coming through right now. It's unclear how those are going to play out because it's turning out that voter suppression is actually may boomerang on Republicans, and they're not sure exactly what they're going to do with it, but be cautious of it. You've got to motivate the electorate to go to the polls, reach out to your friends. Market disruption. Apart from voters, donors, the military, and media endorsers, the most powerful force to pressure Congress is the markets. When the markets start rumbling, their donors get really unhappy, their constituents get very unhappy, and they are worried about losing their jobs. So unions can be very powerful in mobilizing labor strikes, but even protests that make it difficult to access airports, those were very powerful in other countries. The states, I call this multi-state muscle. States have a unique role to play. They have their own militias, their own guards, and those can be used as a way to mobilize to protect protesters, to protect the people of the state of California, as opposed to having them be co-opted. And states can join together. You can have people coming from Oregon down to California. Motions, you can file motions in state courts. State courts have responsibility for enforcing the federal Constitution. And then finally, getting members of Congress to act en masse. Members of Congress, I was chair of the Fulbright board, and I've done a lot of other things in Congress, so I lobbied a lot of members of Congress for good causes. They don't like what's going on at all. Most of the Republican members of Congress do not like what is going on. But every one of them is afraid. You look at what happened to Ben Sasse. Anyone remember his name? He defied this president, and now, he described it as looking into an open political grave. Not only is he persona non grata in his party, he can't get elected anywhere. His whole career is in that dimension is stopped. But even in a new career, he can't get board positions. He's blackballed. Most of these folks didn't make a ton of money as members of Congress, and they're scared. They're scared they're going to be attacked by MAGA supporters. They're scared that they are going to lose a job that they love and that they've worked their whole lives for. And they're scared that once they're out, they won't be able to find anything else to do because of the retribution and retaliation. So we need to give them the support. We need to reach out and mobilize to strengthen their hand, to make it more difficult for them to submit than to fight. And if you get 20 members of Congress together, 20 senators, it's a whole new ballgame. 20 Republican senators, 10 Republican senators would completely change this. That's all it takes. And so identifying those individuals and having a relentless focus on making Congress do its job is going to be another key. So there are things we can do, and we've seen acts of courage already. Courage is contagious, and now we have one of the most courageous city attorneys in the country who can start grilling me on how we take these from just words and ideas into action. So, David?
I want to start with maybe the issues, the events of the day.
Yes.
So this morning we had a federal appellate court, 3 judges, 2 Trump appointees who were asking questions that might suggest they may side with the Trump administration on this issue of National Guards being ordered into Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Last week, Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth said he would obey a Supreme Court order to remove troops, but not necessarily other courts who are considering this issue. You wrote in March your article around bluff justice that Trump was on the edge of open defiance, but not yet defying the courts. Question that many of us are debating right now is, has that red line been crossed yet?
It hasn't been crossed yet, but he's being very, very cute about it. So, for example, in the case of deportation of an American citizen to El Salvador or to someone with a green card who, and where the Justice Department confessed error and said that he should not have been transferred, the Supreme Court said he has to be returned. And that the administration has to facilitate that. And the administration's response was, boy, facilitate, it's such a complicated word. I mean, it's so many syllables, and, like facilities, we know what that is, but what? And so they just hemmed and hawed about how they were going to do this, and they said, oh, and also Bukele, the president of El Salvador, he's not being very cooperative, and even though we're paying him to keep our prisoners and we're paying them lots of money, we have no leverage over El Salvador. He's just such a powerful leader. They played all sorts of games, but they have not said we won't return American citizens as required by the Supreme Court. And so to that extent, they are walking right on the edge. But they have not openly defied this, because what happens is once you're clear that you're not going to obey the Supreme Court on matters going forward or in a particularly hot issue, that's when people take to the streets. I mean, that's when the public pushes back, and that's happened historically. Machiavelli talks about how, that's the tough red line, and it's spelled, or as he likes to say, ruined a lot of good authoritarians.
So I love the title of your article, Bluff Justice.
Yeah.
And the thesis is that Donald Trump is, to your point, sort of flirting with the edge. He is bluffing judges and essentially saying he's going to go right up to that line and he's daring them to say no to him, but it's potentially a bluff. And usually when you're playing a game of bluff, the goal is to call out the bluff. I'm curious if you could dictate sort of strategy in the courts, what should we be doing to call out the bluff?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is this kind of a conversation. Understanding that he's playing a heads I win, tails you lose kind of game. What he says is, I'm going to break every law that I possibly can in a very overt way, and you may or may not take me to court. If you don't take me to court, I've won. I've just arrogated power to myself that I don't deserve. If you take me to court, maybe I get the right judge, maybe a Supreme Court that is sympathetic to me will rule in my favor, and again, I've gained power that I do not have under the Constitution. So there's no loss to me in taking this approach. And if the courts keep shutting me down and keep calling me out for these actions, then I still win. Because then I can argue, I have this agenda that's trying to put people first, and it's being thwarted by these unelected, philosopher kings in black robes who have, who are preventing, my agenda and your agenda from being accomplished. And so now we need to strip their powers and use that to increase him. He's already threatened to impeach judges who rule against him, and there have been a number of articles of impeachment drafted up by members of Congress because the president wants them to. So he uses it either way. And once people understand that that's the game, then they don't get offended when courts stop him. They understand the courts are doing their job. And the more the courts stop him, the more it becomes clear that he is violating the law. He is arrogating power. He was playing a game with us. And that, it's the emperor has no clothes. He doesn't have the legal authority to do it. He only gets the legal authority that we let him have. The other way that this works, just to finish it off, is that he's a unique person in his personality. I'm probably not the first person who's noticed that. When pressed, his reaction is, I have to come back at you 10 times harder. So the first time you resist him, he will come back at you 10 times harder. If you resist again, because you didn't get the message, then he goes 10 times harder than that, which is 100 times harder than he started. And then again, you're up to 1,000 times, another order of magnitude. At some point, the first, second, third pushback, he's crossed a line. It's family separations at the border. It's, Obregón Garcia case in El Salvador. These are the moments where people say, "Oh wait, that looks like he's going too far." So pushing back against this agenda will force his hand to do things that are not in his self-interest, but he just can't help himself, and will help expose what's really at the core of a lot of this effort.
One thing you wrote about in your article is about how defying the courts, if that's what Trump is going to do, is a nuclear option, but he's playing what you refer to as sort of a neutron bomb approach. Could you explain what you mean by the neutron bomb approach?
Yeah, so the neutron bomb approach is basically, you leave the building standing, but, the people aren't there doing anything. And what he would do is have a court system in place that looks like a court system. There's a court system in Russia. There's a court system in Hungary. But those courts, if it's a dispute between me and my neighbor, they call balls and strikes the way they normally would have. It's only in situations where the interests of the state or friends of the state or other leaders with power are involved, where it's just a masquerade and you realize that the fix was always in. And whenever a judge in one of those countries eventually gets sick of doing it and defies the convention and actually rules against someone who's a friend of the ruler, in Hungary there are cases of them having their children and family members kidnapped and or threatened with death or other things, and they leave the bench pretty quickly. So you end up with a group of loyalists, and you have kangaroo courts.
You, as an ambassador, you follow foreign policy much more closely than most Americans. Curious how you would describe what's happening here in the United States to what has happened in recent years in Russia under Putin, in Hungary under Orban, or others. And I want to mention there's one of my favorite books recently that I've read is a book called When Democracies Die by Stephen Litovsky. And as a political scientist, he writes about the fact that in modern history, we have seen many democracies turn into authoritarian regimes, not at the end of a barrel of a gun, not through a military coup or violence, but through the undercutting of democratic institutions year after year, month after month, week after week. Curious your observations of what Trump is doing, how it compares to the Putin or Orban playbooks.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Modern day authoritarians have become much more sophisticated about how to do this. They try to avoid, disappearing people and locking them in bunkers and, that sort of thing, because it didn't work. What they tend to use are modern tools. They use technologies which have, I'll give a quick anecdote from my time as an ambassador. There was a period of time where we really thought these new technologies were going to perfect democracy. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, democracies are flourishing and proliferating around the world. And in the most entrenched autocracies, the only reason that they existed was their ability to limit the information that the public had to understand that they didn't have to live this way, and to be able to organize against their repressive government. And we thought that between, Google searches so you could find out what was going on, and at that time, MySpace and Facebook, and the ability to organize groups informally, and the fact that everyone could have devices to accomplish that with an iPhone in their pocket, that they would be able to allow democracy to flourish, even in these entrenched places. And that actually started to happen. You saw Tunisia fall. You saw Egypt fall. You saw Yemen fall. And everyone called it the Arab Spring, and we clinked champagne glasses. What we didn't appreciate is that the autocrats were seeing the same thing. And they were watching that if a amateur, unfunded rabble could take these tools and bring down autocrats, not only was it an existential threat to them, but it was a tremendous opportunity for them. Because imagine what they could do with these tools. There's a great book by Anne Applebaum called Autocracy, Inc. that talks about how autocrats, they prop each other up, they run illegal munitions and traffic drugs and other things, and then fund each other while they're subject to sanctions in order to create markets for one another and keep them all afloat, and to use technologies to micro-target populations to turn them against each other. And then they started applying it to democracies. And then people within democracies who had their own agenda said, well, that works pretty well. And they started using it as well. And so these technologies are extraordinarily powerful, and they are being used in order to divide us against one another, to confuse our ability to know what's true and what isn't, and who we can trust and who we can't, until people start to throw up their hands. And probably the thing I heard most often during that first 30 days of the Trump administration was people saying, I don't know what to do. They're stunned, they're paralyzed, because they didn't know what was happening, why it was happening, who was doing it, what the facts were, which information source they could trust. And that's exactly what authoritarians want. Because if you don't know that, you can't self-govern. You can't be a democracy. Democracy is all about knowing what you want, knowing what the facts are, choosing the leaders who are going to do what you want, and being able to hold them accountable if they don't. And if you don't know what you want and what the facts are and who you can trust and who you can and whether they're doing what you said or not, how can you self-govern?
Shifting the conversation to another incredibly important institution, the courts, and specifically the Supreme Court. I will say, as you know, the majority of cases that have been brought against the Trump administration, lower courts have ruled against the Trump administration. In fact, I'll mention of the 6 cases that San Francisco that we have brought through our office in the first 103 days, which, by the way, is 8 times the pace of our litigation from the first Trump administration. We have won in all the lower courts, 6 for 6. But there's this institution called the Supreme Court. And you've clerked for the former Chief Justice, Justice Rehnquist. Curious about your observations about this court. And my question is, the court has to know they're playing a game of chicken. There's a bluff game. And they're trying to figure out what moment they're going to assert their authority, because they know that if they call a bluff and Trump just says, screw you, I'm not going to enforce that, certain things are going to happen. Curious your thoughts on your observations of what is happening in the courts. Are you optimistic that they might pick their moments to assert judicial authority and follow the rule of law?
I'm concerned, actually, that is what they're doing. They are picking moments where they think they can get away with asserting rule of law, as opposed to having a direct confrontation. And to some extent, that's what Marbury versus Madison was. In that case, Chief Justice Marshall decided the case in a way that politically helped the new administration, but established a principle that would be much more significant for the court. Unfortunately, I think they're doing the opposite. They're deciding cases in a way which oppose the president, for example, on an individual case of a person who was sent to El Salvador without any basis whatsoever, in violation of all due process rules. But then, in the context of it, suggesting that, well, maybe he can apply the Alien Enemies Act to other people in this case, and not in any way calling out this effort to avoid due process entirely and all the rules that go with the punishment of American prisoners by sending people to El Salvador. So I think this Supreme Court, in the way it's operating, is unlikely to be, the champion of rule of law. And I do worry that we're fighting a rearguard action through the lower courts as these advance up to the Supreme Court. And that's why I'm not counting on the Supreme Court to save us. I think the only people who save us are ourselves. The only things that are going to stop where we're going right now will be the masses, all of us, the markets, and if things get too dangerous, potentially the military. But that's where we are, and I think we need to be sober-eyed about that.
I'll just make an observation on that. So the first case that San Francisco filed against the administration, we were the first city to sue on birthright citizenship, in part because the seminal Supreme Court case in that involved a San Franciscan who in 1897 asserted the fact that he had been born here in San Francisco, lived on Sacramento Street, but was considered to not be a citizen. And now we have 127 years later this conversation at the court about whether the 14th Amendment's plain language ought to hold and whether the Wong Kim Ark case involving that gentleman who I just mentioned ought to be sustained. What was interesting when the court considered at oral argument this case, rather than rule squarely on the merits of that question, they're going to duck it this time, and they're looking at a procedural question about whether they should give in to the Trump administration's idea that that there shouldn't be what are known as national injunctions. This idea that if one court rules that what the Trump administration is doing is unconstitutional, a national injunction would say the Trump administration shouldn't be allowed to exert its authority nationally. This court may say, well, 7 courts have already held that birthright citizenship is constitutional in 3 different circuits. But in those other 8 circuits where there hasn't been a ruling, well, maybe the Trump administration should be allowed to continue banning birthright citizenship, which would mean that depending on when or where you are born, you may or may not be a citizen. That sort of gets to your point of the opportunities the court's looking to placate this president when the rule of law is quite clear.
Yeah, and look, if they continue on that effort, it means that in every case where there is a clear violation of federal law, you're going to have to file at least 50 lawsuits so that in every state it's applied, or in every circumstance it's applied, which means it takes a long time, and some states are going to be slower than others for political reasons or for other reasons. And then on top of it, you're most likely to have a situation where eventually everyone decides the only way to get this decided is in the U.S. Supreme Court. Anyone have a guess on how many cases the U.S. Supreme Court decides in a year? When I clerked there, we hit the high water mark of 150 cases in a year. They currently decide between 50 and 60 cases in a year. So either the president consumes the entire docket of the court and overwhelms the court with all of these cases, and they're not equipped to try cases. They don't hear witnesses. They're an appellate court. So effectively, what happens if you get rid of injunctive powers of lower courts, or strip them by law of the ability to decide on the powers of the president and leave that only to the Supreme Court, is that you ensure that the president can get away with 90% of what he or she wants to do.
I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. Let me start with this, which is, what role can local governments, local jurisdictions have in defending against encroaching federal power, and how can state officials legally combat the administration?
So, states can enact their own constitutional provisions. They're subject to the Supremacy Clause, but you could have state legislatures increasing protections of their own people through state constitutions. You can have the states assert their own rights. The 10th Amendment provides that all powers that are not expressly granted to the federal government in the Constitution or prohibited from the states exercising vis-a-vis the people are reserved to the states. So states, there are a lot of things that have never been addressed, and the states can exercise their powers and challenge actions of the Supreme Court under the 10th Amendment. There are, you can file cases in state court. You don't have to file U.S. constitutional cases in federal court. I used to teach constitutional law at Berkeley, so this is back then we thought this was kind of a theoretical conversation. It's not theoretical anymore. This is what would likely happen. And then finally, at a local level, I think being able to, organize groups to defend the rights of people to peacefully protest, to assert their constitutionally protected rights, is important. And that can be done politically. It can be done through local ordinances, but it can also just be done through people power. People showing up when they hear about a court case where a true injustice is about to happen, and making a lot of noise. The one thing that members of Congress hate is getting lots of hate mail. That's, and so if you start getting that crank going, in many cases, all they have to do is lose, a few key donors and get some negative press, and they're suddenly they're vulnerable to a primary challenge, even in a very red state, or a red district. So they're very sensitive to these things.
Shifting a little bit, conversation around the Republican Party and whether it has evolved so far to accommodating the administration. Do you think there is any hope for the GOP to break away from what's happening?
No. Honestly, no. Look, I think I think after the last election, my statement to people during the election was, whoever loses this election is going to have to blow themselves up a bit. If the Republican Party loses the election, then they can't run Donald Trump a fourth time when he is, 83 years old, and no one else is there to really pick up his mantle. They're going to have to come up with a whole different platform as a party. And if the Democrats lose to this agenda, because they were so focused on just trying to eke out a victory by 1% as opposed to actually solving people's problems the way they used to, then the Democratic Party is going to have to fundamentally change itself. And so I think neither party should be going back to its old ways. In fact, Democrats have sort of inherited the worst of all possible worlds, because now they're the status quo party. They've adopted the old conservatives that have rejected MAGA. They've accepted the Democrats and the people who are hostile to how government's been working for the last 30 years, blame Democrats for all of it, because they represent that whole history. I don't think it's fair, but I think that's where we are. So my sense is that for the moment will come not with the Republican Party having a moment of revelation. I think what's going to happen will be that at some point members of Congress recognize that it's in their own self-interest that they need to reject what's happening, that the administration has gone too far, and it will reassert its power as a body. And start reminding us of what this democracy is actually supposed to look like, how it's supposed to operate.
And you think that is the Democrats winning it back, or it sounds like sending enough hate mail to the Republicans might get them to move in the right place?
It's both. I think the Democrats have to win the midterm. I don't know where we'll be if they lose the midterm, because then there's no institutional check and there's almost a validation of what's occurring. But I also think that if the win is big enough, that's what starts getting the members of the Republican Party who see their colleagues falling because of fealty to this approach. That gets them to start thinking they need to act differently in Congress, they need to fight back, and courage is contagious. And once you see a handful of Republican members of Congress stepping up together, I think it emboldens everyone to call out what is clearly not, we founded this country to stop exactly what is happening right now. That was the purpose of our revolution. And the reason that the Constitution was written as it was, to separate powers and to create a competition between different powers so there were checks and balances, and between the states and the federal government so there were checks and balances, was so that there wouldn't be one king who dictates what the law is. And right now, that's what we have.
So since I have him as a captive audience, I'm going to ask you if you could bring any lawsuit against the Trump administration, what would that be? I'm obviously looking for some ideas here.
Yeah. Well, I would have said birthright citizenship, because it is such a, as I said, it's such a clear distillation of the hypocrisy that is being promoted here. You had a group of people saying we need to change the courts to ensure that there is original intent and textualism. Right? We know what the text says. It is, undebatable. And we know what the original intent was because we had Supreme Court decisions written by people who were alive during the time it was passed, saying exactly what its purpose was. And you've had that held through consistent precedent for 127 years. That is sort of the case that says he wrote an executive order. Right? If you want to overturn any precedent, you either have to do it through a constitutional amendment or through a Supreme Court decision that overturns its own prior precedent. and you would take it up through the courts in a series of decisions that allow it to be properly ventilated. That is how our judicial system works. And instead, the president says, I woke up this morning, I wrote an executive order, birthright citizenship is dead. Right? It's a violation of every principle that the Federalist Society and backers of the president who have supported, his reclaiming the bench, have argued for 50 years. So putting that one up front and being able to let the public really stare at that and let every Republican who is now, turned on their principles in order to have more power, reflect on that, I think is the, that should be the case. And that's why I think they're ducking it this first time. And they're going to try and give the president something on it. And then we'll eventually, as I said, they're just going to keep giving the president 80% of what he wants until there's nothing left.
Well, we've already brought that case.
Thank you.
I actually, one question was asked was for me to explain for a moment the cases we're working on. I'm just going to take 60 seconds to give you time to think of the next case you're going to bring. But so at this moment, we sued on birthright citizenship. We have sued to protect San Francisco and sanctuary jurisdictions around the country from not having our federal funding stripped because we dare suggest that our police officers should not be deputized as ICE agents. Yeah. We have sued the Trump administration for stripping away healthcare data that has been collected based on race and ethnicity and other differences that human beings may have. We sued the Trump administration for cutting funding to San Francisco educators through the AmeriCorps program who dare to assist at-risk students. We have sued when Trump has tried to strip away $50 million of our funding that we're providing to homeless individuals on the streets under anti-equity provisions. We have sued on the idea that Trump should not be able to federally dismantle the federal government wholesale. And as I mentioned, we've been successful in the lower courts. But from my perspective, to your point, he is going at such a muzzle velocity pace, to quote Steve Bannon, that we have not put up enough shields around civil society, and there's so many more things that we could do. So if you don't have any thoughts now, I'm going to call you tomorrow, and I'm going to ask you to think about that. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah. Well, I'd say two things. One is you have to go after him for abuse of emergency powers, and you really have to go after use of the Alien Enemies Act. The tariff power, tariff power is only for extraordinary and unusual events, and the statute he's using doesn't even mention tariffs as one of the things the president can do. It just says the president can regulate in extraordinary and unusual times the economy, and they have just completely distorted that authority. So I think there's an opportunity to bring an action there. But the most important thing, if I leave folks with one key point, is there are two things that are where the Rubicon is crossed. One is where rule of law disappears. The other is where the military is politicized. And we are rapidly approaching that as well. So I think, there was what was argued today was, people were talking about the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which was signed into law by Rutherford Hayes, which basically says that only in very, very limited circumstances can the U.S. military be deployed for a domestic purpose. And the reason that it took until 1878 is it was, it's in Latin. So this is like a principle of every republic. And it hadn't actually had to be written into the Constitution. It was only after a civil war that Congress realized that we needed to have that principle clearly embedded in our law. So where you see politicization of the military, that is the other place where everyone's got to do what you can when you're a city attorney and you've got the powers that you have. I'd make that your highest priority.
I know we only have 2 minutes left, so I have one final question for you.
Yes.
I want to end on a moment of hope. Because Lord knows we need it right now.
The Giants.
So you mentioned your 5 M's. I will say that I often talk about the 3 C's of what we need to do at this moment. We need to continue to run to the courts. We need to build crowds wherever we can, whether it be physical crowds or organizing people, mobilizing folks. And we need courage. We need folks who are standing up, saying what needs to be said. You've talked about the 5 M's. Wonder if you could end with some thoughts on what does effective mobilization look like today? Yeah. Everyday folks who are sitting here thinking, what can they do in their sector if they're not attorneys, if they're not natural political activists, if they don't have the ability to call up a senator and tell them what to do? What would you have everyday San Franciscans and Californians do?
Yeah, courage is contagious. Just the mere fact that you would send an email to someone you went to school with who is, in a, they may be in another state, maybe a state that, supported the president in the last election, and you just say, here's what I'm worried about, and here's why I need your help. Just reaching out, we all have networks. We all have things we can do. Even if you're anxious and don't want to do that, you can drive people to polls. You can, you can send letters so you don't actually have to talk to anyone. You can send them to strangers. There are all sorts of organizations, but if we all think about it, we all know someone who has some influence. And stepping up and saying, I've got one chance to talk to you, this is what I want to talk to you about, that tells them something. And the people around you who hear you say that, it gives them courage. Courage is contagious. Every person has the capacity to make change. And the one reason that I'm optimistic about this is all of these countries around the world have at some point have moved to authoritarianism, have hated it, and have tried to break out of it, and most of them have. During the Arab Spring, that was real. People left to their own devices want freedom. There's a reason why people in North Korea will run across a minefield and risk their own lives to be free. There is a reason why a protester will stand in front of a tank and hold up a sign. There's a reason why the people who defend us stand on a wall against a hostile enemy in forlorn places around the world. Because there's an inherent desire in all of us for freedom, for self-determination, for self-governance. And that's what gives me hope. We all have it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. Thank you for spending your time. You heard it from the ambassador. He has given us a charge to go out there and give them hell and give them hope. Hope you'll all take a little time to think about what every single one of you are going to do. I want to take a moment and thank the Commonwealth Club, the World Affairs organization that we're all part of. Ambassador, thank you so much. Please join me in one final thank you to Ambassador.